Greetings and welcome to another Catholic Reflection. Today I'm going to do something I normally don't do because I generally focus on just teaching people about what the Catholic Church teaches, to do catechesis, and to generally focus on building up the body of Christ as much as possible, help people understand theology. And so if you haven't seen many of those videos on my channel, be sure to explore, like and subscribe, of course, if you find that it is helpful. I like to think it can be very helpful to people. I will premise today's video with several notes. First being that I have only done one response video in the past, and that is when Taylor Marshall rose certain questions concerning Vatican II, where he was interpreting Nostra Aetate, I think it's called, in a modernist manner. And so I really felt that I needed to help people better understand a better interpretation of that text as opposed to how a modernist would attempt to twist it, and the way that some radical traditionalists attempt to or fear that it actually means, when in both cases it is erroneous. I will also say that because I've done so few of these, in regarding to Catholic theology, when the video is very specific concerning a matter in the Catholic Church, that this video will attempt to allow the content creator to speak for themselves. So instead of just playing snippets of what Brian says, I'm going to allow the video in its entirety to ensure that those who see this video in this video and have not seen the video in full in all its context will be able to know exactly what is being said, how it's being framed, and the discussions before and after the comments that I want to respond to. I also want to say that I have great respect for Brian. I have great respect for a lot of Catholic content creators. We agree on quite a bit of things. I've enjoyed a lot of his content, and that this response says nothing about the quality of his channel. It says nothing about his viewership. It doesn't have anything to do with whether or not this is going to be done in the spirit of charity. I want to enter into the dialogue concerning this matter. I do find that the conversation continues to be ongoing, and I fear that the conflicts that have arisen in this regard can be very destructive to our Christian faith, particularly if the question is being raised, can I stay Catholic after this? Apparently, there are people who are questioning their Catholic faith because of a difficulty that they are having concerning their interpretation of Fiducia Supplicans. Now, with that said, in our present day and age, there has been no shortage of difficulties that people have had with interpretation. Interpretation in general can be very difficult, particularly when we are afraid that a text can be or could be interpreted in a manner that is inconsistent with Catholic theology and traditional practice. So with that, I'm going to allow Brian to share his thoughts, and I will at times enter into dialogue with the video and sharing my own thoughts.
So last week I addressed the latest controversy in the church about the new declaration Fiducia Supplicans, which, if you're looking for more reasons to become Catholic, we do have the best names for things, but that's an aside anyway. The declaration gave permission for priests to bless same-sex couples, which, as any reasonable person should have anticipated, has caused controversy, confusion, and even quite a bit of division. And as also should be expected, it has rattled the faith of more than a few people. I saw more than a few comments from people saying things like, I don't know how I can remain Catholic, or simply that they were declaring that they were leaving the church at this point.
This is very disturbing to hear. People who have a tendency to leave the church over a bad interpretation of a document may already have had their foot out, one of their feet out the door. They have already been leaning in this direction for some time, for a variety of reasons, and it's not surprising to me that if somebody is at the last straw, they are so distraught and disturbed and disappointed over a series of things. I will say that I myself have gone through the roller coaster of emotions and thoughts concerning many topics regarding Vatican II, regarding the papacy. And as a convert from a Wesleyan theological tradition, thankfully I had the benefit of being patient with the subject matter and doing everything I can to gain mutual understanding, to ensure that I am properly understanding the nuances, the subtleties, the distinctions involved. Many conversations that I have, say, with fundamentalists, Protestants, a lot of it comes down to, particularly when they say things like, we worship Mary, we quickly and easily run to distinctions to assist them to better understand what we're doing, what we're not doing, the language that we use, the concepts that we entertain, so that they can understand Catholicism on its own terms and not on their own terms and their erroneous misunderstandings of it, those caricatures of the Catholic Church and Catholic teaching that exists only in their own minds. I will say that with the difficulties that people have, I do find that, and I'm speaking more from myself when I talk this way, that I have a personal tendency to not allow these feelings and thoughts that I might have, disappointments, discouragements, to fester in my mind. There were times where I found certain arguments initially influential that that caused me to overly critique certain things in the church. I do think that there's a lot of spiritual warfare that is going on. I do think that it is unhealthy for us to have some have an obsession over certain fine points and arguments, which over time, as I have been able to find adequate solutions to those difficulties, I found that I was distracted less and less. But even then, it almost reminds me of grievance culture in general. People who are so dissatisfied in one way or another, who are experience a lot of discontent in their own spiritual life, may end up overly critiquing things outside of themselves. And as a result, they end up becoming bitter, even though they might not use that term to describe it. Their attitude has become one that is not beneficial to their spiritual journey. So it is understandable that there is a particular category of people who have one foot out the door, who are very angry with the church for one reason or another. The only advice I would have to that is to do your best to focus on the things that you can control, and that is one's own spiritual journey. Focus on living a holy life. Focus on developing virtue, particularly the virtue of charity and patience and long-suffering. It's vitally important that we do not allow ourselves to become so distracted from our love of God that we end up being swept away by controversies and disagreements. Because, like I said, I think some people have an unhealthy attachment to these, whether they're doing it for virtue signaling or some form of self-validation for what they would describe as a righteous anger. Whatever it might be, it is really bad for the spiritual life. It really defiles us, particularly when we can debate people on the internet until we're blue in the face, but ultimately we have no control over what happens in the Vatican. I've had to resign to the fact that with any pontificate, will the Pope do and say, or avoid doing and saying, all the things that I would want the Pope to do? And if the Pope doesn't, am I going to become bitter about it? Am I going to allow that to defile my soul? And the correct response would be no. That is very unhealthy for the spiritual journey. We can do absolutely nothing to affect what happens in the Vatican. I would say that people need to pray for God to guide the Holy Father and not stipulate what that guidance ought to be, and put it in God's hands and trust God to be the one to address any issues that might be going on in the church.
So I wanted to address that concern and respond to the question, am I going to remain Catholic, and should you remain Catholic at this point? But before I answer that question, I wanted to say a little bit more about the document in question, because there have been some developments since then, and a lot has been said, like a lot has been said since then. So figured we might as well say some more. One thing that struck me about it was the timing. Like, think of everything that people are going through right now. Poverty, for example, is proliferating everywhere. I live in a very wealthy, developed part of the world, but there are homeless encampments propping up all over the place.
This is very sad to see. Throughout all of human history, there are those who suffer from poverty.
It's an impossible to ignore symptom of where we're at as a society. And if people are economically desperate where I live, that means that they're probably starving where they used to just be economically desperate. As I don't need to remind anybody, we just came out of a pandemic that was exhausting for everyone.
It's very challenging, because you have people who are below the poverty level, and then you have people who are towing that line, and all it really takes is for a bad economic turn to push people over that line. And so, yeah, I absolutely agree. It's very unfortunate. We should continue to engage in the corporeal work of mercy of clothing the naked and feeding the poor, the hungry, and taking care of the poor. There is a special focus on doing this very thing in the church, just as it was for the apostles.
There are significant wars taking place that weren't before. Families are struggling economically. Many people are mourning the loss of loved ones who died in that pandemic, or are just part of the mysterious increase in mortality that is taking shape in our demographics now. And our healthcare systems, especially here in Canada, are strained and compromised to their limits. But this is the pastoral priority of the highest echelons of the church.
Okay, so up until this point, I absolutely could agree with everything that is being said concerning the preferential option for the poor, the church's social doctrine, which has been clearly elucidated and expanded and developed so that we can better understand exactly what that is, and how, as Catholics, we can take up collections, or we can engage in Catholic action to assist people who are in a time of need, particularly in our own circles of influence, our friends and family. Now, it seems to me that what Brian is saying here is that there are all these other priorities or problems that are going on in the church. Therefore, if the church addresses anything but those, that therefore the church doesn't have proper priorities. Now, the most surprising element to this, to me, when I heard this, is that for years, more traditional Catholics have critiqued the Holy Father for not saying certain things or not doing certain things. When are they going to address the German bishops, for instance? When is he going to respond to dubia? And for years, people have been very discontented over this this inactivity, the sort of things that we have come to expect from the Holy Father as the shepherd of the universal church. I will say that now dubia is being responded to in the manner in which we had hoped that they would be. And this document does target what is going on right now with the German bishops. So I see that finally, after a really long time of silence from the Vatican, after a really long time of people crying out, why aren't you doing anything about this? Why aren't you saying anything about this? Now the Vatican does exactly what we want it to do. It addresses and targets the German bishops, reaffirms Catholic doctrine in relation to their deviations from it and their practices. And now the gripe or the grievance gets shifted to, oh, okay, well, you should have just done that before. While that is granted, it is great to see the Vatican actually doing something that we have asked it to do and have been asking for many years. And now the Vatican tosses us a bone, does exactly what we want it to do, and instead of gratitude and instead of being charitable, we take the grievance which we have nurtured and become accustomed to, and we have lived out of for so long. Once I said, that in and of itself is very unhealthy and bad for the spiritual life. Now that grievance just shifts. The grievance doesn't get resolved in the human heart. Rather, it just moves the goalpost, it just moves to something else, because people have been habituated in this attitude that people are having. Instead of reading or praying and reflecting with devotions from Ligori, in his work, The Way of Salvation, and crying out to God to heal our own sinfulness and to prepare us even now for the beatific vision, to help us to share in his holiness. People have been habituated in a different perspective, that we feel this need that we have to constantly critique. We have to constantly involve ourselves with things that are going on at the Vatican. And now I went down, I think, a little bit of a rabbit hole there, and I don't remember what my point was, other than thank you, Vatican. We need to have an attitude of gratitude. We have to be very thankful that dubia is being responded to, and it's being responded to very quickly. And we have really desired some sort of response from the Vatican concerning these matters, apart from the fact that what the German bishops are doing is already material heresy, that they're engaging in the violation of what the Church already teaches and what the magisterium has already reiterated multiple times throughout 2,000 years of Christian history. But we want them to say something now to the same effect, as if everything has to be said all the time about everything. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think some of those things just go without saying. So I think the attitude of grievance has been habituated, and people, instead of having those grievances resolved, it just gets shifted. Okay, well, that's great that you did this, but you should have been addressing or doing documents and encyclicals and having things come out of the dicastery that address poverty. Those things are well and good, but the thing is the Vatican's not always going to do what we want them to do when we want them to do it. But I think this is the wrong approach. I don't think we should be critiquing that finally dubia is being responded to. Finally, the German bishops are being addressed, and they're being called to account and will be visited over the course of the next few years by people from the Vatican to assess the situation in Germany. Those things are good. I wouldn't at all critique that at all. I have absolutely zero critique or discontent. But I think this comes from the fact that people have just lived in discontent for so long that there has to be something, even when the Vatican does something that is right and good, there still has to be something wrong with it. It's way too late. But it seems odd to me. Maybe people have just resigned to the fact, well, the Vatican's not going to respond to the German bishops. The Pope Francis is not going to respond to dubia. So we're just going to just have that attitude that he's never going to do anything about it. And so we're going to shift our concerns to these other things. So when he finally does address it, we're like, no, we want you to address these other things now. I think that's a little out of place, but we'll continue to listen to Brian speak here.
The urgent need to make same-sex couples feel more included in spite of the countless provisions of inclusion that are already in place to anybody who wants to become Catholic?
Well, I mean, there's plenty of church teaching throughout church history concerning poverty and war, and all of that stuff. So it's like, what's the point of the argument? It's oh yeah, you're doing that, but you should be doing these other things. And if he shifted to do those other things, we would say, well, why aren't you doing enough about the German bishops? Because you have to complain about something. Because people who have habituated this discontent, who live in this mentality of grievance, there has to be something wrong for them to complain about. And believe me, they're just going to shift it around until they find that thing that they can complain about. As for the idea of inclusion, it's an interesting term. The church has always had an open door policy that everybody, no matter who they are, can come into the church and they can begin the journey of holiness. So the church has always had a general attitude towards the church being a hospital for sinners. And absolutely, we want to encourage as many sinners as possible to flood into the church and go through catechesis and to learn how to live a virtuous life, to become acquainted with the will of God, and to follow Christ, their Savior. We welcome that. We absolutely want that. I have no qualifications to that whatsoever. Let's get these people catechized. Let's get them blessed. Let's get them going through the rite of Christian initiation. Let's teach them Scripture. Let's help them on their spiritual journey. And this has been true for anybody and everybody. It's not like only now the church has become inclusive of allowing certain types of sinners to come into the church to receive spiritual guidance and to receive grace from God to know the gospel and live a holy life. The church has always had an attitude towards that. I think where the problem comes in are with those types of people who have overemphasized sin. They're afraid at all costs, all the time. They're afraid that sin is going to be justified, that people are going to justify sin. And they're so afraid of this that they forget how to act charitably, because that they always want to point out sin. For instance, when Biden visited the Pope, when Pelosi visited the Pope, people were mad. Well, why didn't you point out their sins? As if that's what we must do all the time, everywhere, in all circumstances, in all contexts. Go and sin no more, we say. Go and sin no more. And yes, that's always there. And there's a time and place and a kind of relationship that we can have with people where that is most beneficial and suitable. But you can kind of see that there's this overemphasis on sin, so that if sinners come into the church and they seek blessing, or that they seek to live a holier life, they seek the grace of God, they seek guidance, that somehow, make sure you point out their sin to them right here, right now, because we want to just, at the outset, make sure they understand that they were incredibly sinful. These acts cry out to heaven for vengeance, and and that's like the first step. We have to present everybody with the law so they can see just how sinful and disgusting and depraved they are, just how demonic their lives have been, And we completely forget how to really enter into that. Like the instance of the prodigal son coming back to the father runs out to him and just embraces him, right? That's awesome. It wasn't about, well, boy, you really messed up. You hurt your mother something terrible. And yeah, see, that's all there. And when people come to the church repentant and looking for God in their life, I think at that point they have already experienced convictions. And there's many things in their lives that they'll learn over time as their conscience is formed, as it's properly formed by Catholic ethics, as their intellect is properly informed with Catholic teaching. Those things take time. People grow into that, all right? They have to marinate in that, and God uses that to help people to grow and to experience more of His grace and forgiveness. That needs to be where our attitude is. Embracing people who are coming to the church. Give them a hug. Love them, which means what? To will their good? Yes, to will their good. And we can will their good all day long and never justify their sin or give them a pass for things that are very destructive to their souls. But when we become so overly obsessed with, well, they have to know that they're sinning, they absolutely have to know that they're sinning, and that becomes the focal point of everything, because we're so afraid that somehow the hospital for sinners is going to become some sort of citadel for sin, and that the church somehow is going to be completely overran and taken over by sin. Catholic teaching is going to become perverted, and the church is going to defect. And really, it ultimately comes down to a lack of faith in church teaching. Church teaching says that some of the attributes of the church is that it is infallible, that it is indefectible, that the church has a teaching authority from God. And those things will always be the case. And that's what we have to put our faith into, is to recognize that the church is here to lead us into holiness. And so in its official capacity, then, it cannot err in that regard.
Like, if you thought that they were a special kind of victim oppressed class, I could see how you might want to address that problem and to work to alleviate it. But seriously, this is not 40 years ago. We're talking about people who now have their own category in every streaming service that you can get. And not because those categories are popular, but just because, you have to include that. We're talking about people who have a crosswalk emblazoned with their insignia at my city hall, along with their flag on the flagpole steps in front of City Hall. And
the fact that there are people in any category who engage in militant activism for the cause that they are presently a part of has nothing to do with whether or not people who were part of that cause or who have been influenced or spiritually wounded by those causes can't come to the church to seek help. And as we get later in the video, I'll address more concerning that. That's exactly the framework that we're really talking about.
And when someone left a tire track on that crosswalk recently, there was a media campaign and a virtual manhunt for the perpetrators, which they eventually caught and were made an example of, publishing their pictures and their names in the newspaper, and I'm sure will be punished to the fullest extent of the law. But the fact that 4 more churches were set fire to and burnt down deliberately here in Alberta, Canada, where I live, in the weeks leading up to Christmas, in addition to the...
It is true that there there is targeted harassment, there's persecution of Christians that does in fact occur. And I would invite any of those who are part of that persecution to repent and come into the church. Go to a priest and get a blessing. That's a great place to start. There's grace in that. It's the I believe, but help me overcome my disbelief. It's the coming to Christ and saying, away from me, Lord, I'm a sinful man. Or the tax collector, the publican who wouldn't even raise his head to heaven. God have mercy on me, a sinner. We want all people to come into the church. And if there are people who are actively engaging in anti-Catholic persecution, attacking the church, burning churches, actively engaging in causes that are diametrically opposed to the church, if there is any openness in those people to seek the grace of God and come to a proper understanding of what that means, then I welcome that all day long.
Dozens of churches that were vandalized and set fire to in Canada over the past couple of years, we look at that and we're like, well, that shouldn't change the fact that faithful Christians are a privileged class who should probably redistribute some of that privilege to less privileged classes like our friends in the rainbow.
I don't really see that this document, if it would make more sense to me that somebody could at least propose this as a possibility, as this a possible underlying reason or motivation behind the document. But there is already a context. Very specific dubia was raised. That dubia was responded to. And there is a historical context with the issues that are going on with the German bishops that is one step lower, which is why the dubia certainly would be brought up to seek clarification. So when I look at motive, I'm not thinking, okay, I'm going to read into all of this motive of distributing privilege and all this other language. Since I don't think in those contexts or with those concepts, that's not going to be what I'm going to be reading into any of this. Rather, I just look at some very objective aspects, such as the issues of the German bishops. There was dubia. The Vatican responds to that dubia, and it certainly addresses many of the issues with the German bishops. I don't really postulate or assume any motives beyond that coming from the Vatican. So I don't see how talking about how some people could have those kinds of motives in why they might write, said document. But that really is not an objective thing. I think that's maybe just a worry or a concern or a suspicion.
Community. Christians are not some privileged oppressor class. If we were, you'd probably be aware that...
Well, I mean, if we were to enter into that kind of dialogue, I think people are well aware that there are people who are very fundamentalist and have engaged in acts of oppression against people. People are often protested, or there are churches who have become popularized because they would go out and they would hold signs, God hates gays and the things of that nature. Not the way to go about it. I know we need to confront the culture, but I assure you that a person who is presently engaging in homosexual acts, or who are entertaining same-sex attraction, who may even have an openness to God and the things of God, and then they see the sign, and they see the way that they're being talked to and how they're being treated in a very undignified way. You're not making your position very attractive. They're not going to be like the prodigal son, who is running up to the father with open arms. Rather, this is going to turn people off. It's actually going to push them further into their own camp. And I don't think that's what we want to do. I think that is the kind of effect that people have. And so it's kind of an ethical persecution. Now, I'm all for having friends from all walks of life, having conversations of consequence, and getting down to the nitty-gritty of ethics, and ensuring that we're always willing and able to be able to teach people what Catholic teaching is, to be instructive, to educate, right? To instruct the ignorant, for instance. Even in reproving the sinner, there are appropriate ways of doing that, and there are inappropriate ways of doing that. And so, from the perspective of people who may or may not be receptive to God and to the church, who may be presently engaging in these lifestyles, or are presently part of being active for certain causes, or have been influenced by certain ideologies, by all means, we have to critique those ideas, all right? But we also have to do it in such a way that respects the dignity of the individual in that process. We can't be condescending. And while we are certainly judging the sins, we certainly recognize and can demonstrate how people are living outside of God's will. Nevertheless, people have an inappropriate, overly judgmental attitude where they treat the person with less charity than we're supposed to. The person, right? We're not embracing the sins. We're not justifying sinful behavior. We're not turning a blind eye to a depraved condition, right? But rather we enter into that, just like how Christ entered into human history. Usually, if we follow James, where it says that God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. Now, people in any circumstance who may be an opponent of any ideology, or people who subscribe to any particular ethic, have the capacity, with the help of God's grace, to humble themselves in their situation. That wouldn't be a time where we emulate Jesus, who is confronting the pride of the Pharisees. Or that's not where you make a whip and begin tossing tables. All right. There are of course people who are very proud, and they're very angry and attacking the church, and we certainly need to draw the line and say that behavior is inappropriate. We're not going to tolerate you attacking the church. So oppose the proud. That's fine. That's fine. But being gracious towards those people who are at least open-minded and who have the capacity to humble themselves and be humbled, and have that openness to God and the things of God. We need to make sure that we are responding to those things appropriately. And I think that's what Christ did. He responded things to things appropriately. He opposed the proud when he needed to. I like to think that he was much better at it than we were, because he knows what's in a man's heart. And we too often judge by appearances, or we end up becoming embittered by certain things in the culture where it puts us on edge, and that leads us to be more rash in the way that we try to address different circumstances. Where a bad experience we've had with one person who might be in one category, who is very proud and arrogant and attacking the church, and we take that and then we just project that onto anybody who might be in said category, right? Or however they think of themselves. Where we end up displacing our anger and our hurt, and we overgeneralize, and we enter into a kind of prejudice against people, because this person is like that other person in some ways, and I didn't like this one thing about this one person, and I'm going to basically treat this other person over there like I would treat that person, right? And thankfully, Jesus knew exactly when and where and how to do all of that, which is nice, because he was God. It was certainly infallible and proper and just in each and every circumstance. I can't say the same for myself, because we can often be blinded by our rational justifications for why we might treat a person a certain way.
There's a literal genocide, and not the loosey-goosey kind of genocide and casual way we use that term just anywhere we feel like we want to object to some supposed injustice. An actual genocide is taking place in Nigeria, where estimates as high as 50,000 Christians have been killed because they're Christian. And I haven't seen any news coverage on that fact outside of a few Christian commentators. Today, every elementary school, every government agency, every major corporation flies the rainbow flag, often physically in front of their buildings, in large part out of fear of the repercussions if they don't do so. They are not some oppressed class.
I'm not sure how this is relevant to this document, other than that Brian seems to attach this mentality, or attribute this motive to the document. I don't think this needs to be attributed to the document. I think the document stands on its own. I think it can be reasonably interpreted and understood properly within the context of responding to dubia, and also within the broader context of the challenges we have seen with the German bishops.
The need of the Holy See to rescue and make feel included. They are the establishment. Now, a few of the self-styled Orthodox defenders of this particular instruction have celebrated the fact that Cardinal Fernandez...
I think in general, having an attitude of docility, being open to the magisterial teaching through this. I mean, I know there's different layers and different levels of magisterial teaching, and different authoritative weight given to different types of documents, and so on and so forth. But since this document, when properly interpreted, does not violate any Catholic teaching whatsoever, it's just merely stated as if, this document needs some sort of defenders, as if the document is inherently flawed. And he does bring up one example, and we can talk about that one example. But remember, this has to do with interpretations, and we'll talk more about the problem of interpretations in a moment.
Hernandez, who is the prefect for the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, who is the architect of all of this Christmas cheer. He gave an interview.
He's responding to Dubia, and I think he did a really good job.
Interview to The Pillar, in which he explained that according to the instruction, the couple is blessed, not the union.
Right.
The couple, yes. The union, no.
Right. All right. So I'm not going to. What I will say now, and I'll reiterate later, and I'll expand upon that, is that within the document itself, okay, because Brian's concern and what some other people's concerns would be has to do with the semantic range of the word couple, or at least what it can connote to English ears, because of the various ways that we may use that language. But if we interpret couple within the context of the, all right, so if we take that word couple and we simply look at all the different ways in which we can understand that word without considering the context of the document itself, I can see how then people could have concerns. But because that's a poor interpretive methodology, what we then need to do is find out what this term means in the document. What we do know what it can't mean is that it can't parallel or overlap with what union means at all. Because the two terms are used to distinguish something within the document itself, what this means that they're being juxtaposed as two separate and distinct things. All right. So whatever a union is, how it can be defined and understood, when the word couple is being used, it doesn't overlap with that at all. It doesn't mean anything that has to do with union. So we're going to keep union over here. And so then how we understand couple has to be outside of that. Because, like I said, this distinction is made within the document itself. And so there's not going to be that overlap. They're being juxtaposed.
Which is either self-contradictory and he doesn't know it and therefore is woefully unqualified to be occupying that position in the
even if somebody may have been slightly sloppy in their diction in a particular document, all that means is that it needed another layer of editing. It needed some additional proofreading. It wouldn't necessarily say that the person just altogether, absolutely, right? We're just going to, there's an error here, therefore he's woefully, absolutely unqualified in all possible ways, without being charitable with him, without seeing that he may be very capable. Maybe it could be argued that a different word could be used. But whatever word that one could use, all right, understanding that within the document itself, there isn't going to be this, the term union and couple are not being used synonymously, right? They're not being, they can't be interchanged for one another within the document itself. That should be our first clue that this is a juxtaposition, that what is being said about unions cannot at all apply to how we interpret and understand the word couple.
Church, or it's a phrase simply designed to create confusion. And his first
proposing either he's completely unqualified for the job, or he's doing this on purpose and he's being deceptive, and we should be suspicious of him and everything that he does now, because we have attributed this motive to him. I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's charitable to hold to either of those views, because one, like I said, if the document is interpreted properly, that's not where our problem is. the difficulties that we were having in terms of controversy, the controversy exists because documents, just in general, can be interpreted poorly. And that doesn't necessarily even say anything about the document itself. We know that Scripture, there's tens of thousands of cults. All right, there's tons of organizations that say we follow the Bible as our sole authority and rule for life, and faith and morals and all of that. But we do agree that the document, right, as Catholics, is we believe in inspiration and inerrancy. And what we're willing to do when a Muslim or a non-Catholic or anybody else points to something in Scripture, saying this verse contradicts this verse, or this verse contradicts, Catholic teaching, call no man father. What's the first thing that we do? Well, first, starting with the basis that these are only apparent contradictions and not actual contradictions, we go on to explain why what Jesus is saying with the word Father is not what we're doing in terms of referring to the papacy as the Holy Father, for instance. It's a misunderstanding of context because the same English word is being used by us for that purpose. And unfortunately, this happens a lot where we'll take an English word that has a certain connotation to it. Like when Protestants come to us and say, well, it says right here very clearly in the text that Jesus had brothers and sisters. And they're taking a very, European, Western, predominant usage of the word brother, for instance, without understanding that in the Greek world, that the Greek word that is being used there has a broader semantic range. It actually allows for Catholics to interpret it as that these are just kinsmen, right? And so, but that wouldn't be a problem with the text. That wouldn't be a problem with the word that is being used, right? Adelphos, I believe it is. That's not a problem with the word adelphos. We could say, well, the writer should not have used the word adelphos because at some point in time or in some other language, the connotations that are often attached to that term is going to lead them to disagree with the doctrine of the perpetual virginity of Mary, for instance. So it's not necessarily an inherent problem within the document. Now, I'm not saying this document is inerrant in the same way that Scripture is. I'm just saying, as a principle of interpretation, it needs to be recognized that while there may be some semantic overlap between the usage of the English word brother and the Greek word adelphos, we must recognize that sometimes the word adelphos may have a broader semantic range, allowing for meanings that aren't commonly associated with the English word brother. And so, once again, the problem that one could have here is with a translation, with the limitations of another language. We see that often sometimes there's dialogue between whether or not a Latin word that's used to translate a Greek word may also not have the exact same semantic range. There can be a lot of overlap, but there could be certain connotations of the Greek that isn't overlapped by the Latin, and there can be some connotations to the Latin that aren't reflected in the Greek at all. And so one problem that could possibly arise as a result of this is that if the the author's intent in the Greek was to express a connotation. That's part of the semantic range of the Greek, but isn't contained within the Latin. And then the interpreter of the Latin takes a meaning of, or the connotation of the Latin that isn't included in the Greek. Then we could get the text to say something that it cannot say, simply because we've translated it into another language. So there are language barriers. And I think part of what we're seeing here is that we have certain connotations with the word couple in our culture. But once again, this is an English translation from, this was probably originally written in Latin. I don't know. I don't get into all those kinds of things. But that may even not be an issue. But what I am saying is that within the text itself, context, it's part of the hermeneutical circle, right? A word needs to be understood based on the context in which how it's being used. And the words help to frame that context, right? And so there's a kind of reciprocity or an internal dialogue within the text between the terms that are being used and how they qualify and shape one another, right? And many times this is very helpful to ascertain what the text could not mean as a result. And in the document Fiducia Supplicans, in this document, the word union and couple are being juxtaposed. Okay, and we always have to keep that in mind, that whatever we come to think about and what the intent by the author was concerning the meaning or how couple is to be understood, it needs to be understood completely outside of union. It needs to be completely outside of union.
1 Corinthians remind us God is not the author of confusion, but of peace. And so too.
Correct. And which in this case, I'm not going to attribute malice to Fernandez. I'm not going to, I don't even necessarily need to attribute error to the document. There is sufficient reason to two controversies that are easily explained simply owing to subtleties in a text. All texts can be misunderstood. Jesus was misunderstood. Scripture is highly misunderstood because people want to try to make out of it whatever they want to make out of it. And then there are those who fear that the document means things that they don't want it to say, and so on and so forth.
Two, should his pastors who presume to represent him in some way, because the word couple is describing two things as one thing. It's a way of taking a plurality and reducing it to a singularity.
I suppose we could do this when we use the word they as a third person plural, where we're talking about, it's not in the singular, it's in the plural. They are standing over there, right? I wouldn't have any problem with third person plural pronouns.
What do we call that when multiple things become one thing? A union. That's literally what the word union means. So if you're going to...
here it's being conflated. Obviously, if people, for instance, are in a irregular relationship, this could be a man and a woman who may intend to become engaged at some point in the future. They're courting, they're considering marriage as a possible option, and they have decided in the heat of a moment to pass a romantic line And that's not what they want for their relationship. They don't want to engage in premarital relations. They want to have a better, stronger, holier relationship that is in line with God's will and with the teaching of the church. They want to develop virtue, and they want their relationship to be characterized by that. If they were to present themselves to the priest and be like, hey, we have this friendship, and we want to have holier boundaries and have that intent of seeking God's design, that marriage is for the procreation and education of children, and they're not married, or in the case of people who can't get married, let's say these are two divorced people, but they've become very close friends, and for the most part, maybe they've had really healthy boundaries, but they toed over that line. They didn't avoid the near occasion of sin. The relationship began to grow in such a way that it began leaning towards romance. And I can see them also wanting to live a holy life, because as long as they had valid marriages in the past and that their spouses are still alive, that they're ineligible to enter into a second sacramental marriage, and knowing that, and wanting to have their friendship blessed so that it could more accurately reflect the holiness of God. That is a very good and true and a virtuous thing, and I would certainly encourage that. This too could happen between two people of the same sex, where if they experience same-sex attraction, like in the two instances before, that the two individuals are attracted to one another to one degree or another, and in such a way that it could potentially lead to romance. It's the question or the thesis of when Harry met Sally. Could a man and a woman, or can two people who have an attraction to one another to one degree or another, actually remain friends? Is this something that is possible? Now, it's true that people sometimes fly too loose with their boundaries, and as a result, married men or married women often end up engaging in an emotional affair because they ended up getting their needs met, and they started bonding with somebody that they were attracted to. And there's always that danger in relationships, even in sacramental marriages between a man and a woman who are baptized and have the intent for the procreation and education of children. The danger exists with poor boundaries, that these sorts of relationships can occur. Now, if there are people who certainly want the grace of God in their life, and they want to be able to have the proper boundaries, and that they want to develop those disciplines to be able to keep the friendship where it needs to be and not transcend or violate those boundaries, God's grace is paramount. It's very necessary that as we develop a proper relationship with God, that we would too want to develop proper relationships with other people. And that, I believe, is at the core of what this document is actually saying. Because in a sense, that there can't be unions, right? These are things that are said of people. That there are people who say of themselves, I should say, excuse me, that they are in a union, right? Sorry, I coughed and I lost my train of thought there a little bit. But the general takeaway, though, is to recognize that people who are in irregular situations, or they're dealing with attractions and of one kind or another, and they're just really unhealthy boundaries there. They certainly need the grace of God, and I can see like an informal blessing or something that's done spontaneously, where it just happens to be that both the people are there, and they both happen to be talking to the priest at the same time, and they have an intent to follow the design of God for human relationships and all of that. That stuff is all well and good, and it's pretty much the gist of what we should be taking away from the document. Once again, I think the fear that people have is what they are afraid of what the document means, or what the document could be used for. All documents can be misinterpreted. All documents can be misused. They can be misunderstood. If there's a certain clarity that we wish that it had or something like that. But I personally have never had any issues with the document. I don't engage in a lot of debate concerning it. It never really bothered me, because I think the document does a really good job of saying what is a marriage, and then the juxtaposition of union and couple. And I actually elaborated and explained some examples of different types of relationships, couples. I can kind of use that synonymously in a sense, right? People who have coupled themselves beyond just being merely platonic. There's a little bit more there, right? There's a little bit more bonding, perhaps. Although the document doesn't go into certain subtleties concerning the word couple in that regard. Whatever couple is to mean here, once again, it cannot mean anything that has to do with union, right? We're talking about the individuals. We're talking about the desire of the two people, even together, to have the relationship, the friendship blessed in such a way that they can be more appropriate with each other, be more respectful of nature and of God's laws, and so on and so forth. We can have similar instances where you can have a married couple who they've been using contraception, and they're still really new to the idea of not using it. They're not very educated in natural family planning. Maybe they have some misunderstandings of what it actually is, and they've been concerned about their intent, the procreative principle of the conjugal act, and they go to a priest, and they want to wean off it. It kind of reminds me of when people become Catholic. What percentage do you think are actually fulfilling that precept of the church that requires us to fast? Right? How many Catholics do you know, maybe even for the first few years of being Catholic, or have been Catholic for decades, that they may just struggle with the discipline of fasting? And so they are de facto violating the precept, and they could and probably should frequent the confessional in regards to this, because we want to avoid any kind of spiritual sloth, for instance. If a person wants and has the intent to follow the church, right, not our own whims, but to follow the church, I think some people's concern is, well, how does the priest properly discern whether or not the people who are coming up to him have the right intent? This can be really hard. For the most part, there could be people who are going to the Eucharist, right? And there could be quite a few of them. who are in a state of mortal sin. They haven't gone to confession. They just justify going to the Eucharist. They may not even properly even understand what a mortal sin is, or the sacramental role of penance and all of that in relation to it. I would have to say that I can see that a priest trying to adjudicate on a case-by-case basis every single person who comes to the altar rail, who sticks out their tongue. What do you really expect the priest to do? To know the ins and outs, the intricacies of each and every human heart that presents itself for communion. I really wouldn't expect a higher standard in relation to something that's not even sacramental, something that is informal or spontaneous, to go into that great depth. But I think owing to the various kinds of abuses, I think additional instruction would certainly be prudent, such as not doing this publicly, maybe even setting up an appointment with the priest to talk about their circumstances if they're seeking guidance, if they want to have some help on how they could better set up some boundaries, because they don't want to completely eliminate the friendship and never be friends ever again. They just want the friendship to now be more appropriate. And so I think there could be some prudence on the part of priests who do these things. Obviously what James Martin did with that picture of those two guys holding hands, for example, was incredibly imprudent. It certainly sent the wrong message. It certainly was meant to be provocative. There's nothing in this document that should make someone like James Martin feel at all validated, or even as if this is some sort of step in the right direction, because the whole point of the blessing is so that the relationship, the friendship, is more appropriate, more in line with God's will. And so that means eliminating sexual immorality and working towards chastity, right? So it's not at all as he would present it. Things aren't as he understands things to be anyways, because he continues to violate church teaching, just much like the German bishops do. So I don't really take, I wouldn't use what James Martin thinks, says, and does as any kind of guidance for understanding the legitimacy or quality of a Vatican document.
Give such a disorienting and incoherent explanation, you're going to have to define your terms. What is specifically meant by union? What is specifically meant by couple?
Sure.
Which he refused to do, thus perpetuating the...
Well, I'm not sure he refused to do that. I think in that interview with Pillar, I think it was, forgive me if I'm wrong, I have a bad memory, but like I said, even in the document itself, I never equated those terms. I never even conceptualized them as having any kind of overlap at all, because they're juxtaposed. Two different terms are being used because each term is describing a different reality. There's a distinction between the two terms. I don't want to reiterate semantic overlap and cultural connotations and all of that sort. I think that with that being said, and understanding that the text purposely uses a different word to describe these relationships, or even if there are people who think of themselves in a union according to the definition of the document, they can still approach the priest with the intent of not having that union in that manner anymore, right? To cease crossing those ethical boundaries and to have more appropriate boundaries for the friendship that they have and want to retain. Because there's a lot of people who have lifelong friendships, and it's understandable people don't want to lose those friendships just because, you know, they cross the line at some point. But the desire to not want to cross that line, for instance, is what's key here. The church wants to help guide sinners towards holiness. Remember, it's not just about not sinning, because there's sins of commission, there's sins of omission, there's sins of attitudes of the heart, and so on and so forth, you know, word, thought, deed, and all of that. The real issue is that we can cultivate a deeper love for God, not just mere sentiment, but to really understand his revelation, to know, love, and serve God, right? And to be shaped and molded by the three theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. And this is going to involve a lifelong process of catechesis and spiritual disciplines. And people need to be aware that they're free to pursue that, and God can bless that, and that is the purpose of this document.
The ongoing confusion, division, and drama in the church. And some people have argued, some respectable people, some people that I admire have argued that a couple doesn't always mean what you seem to insist that it does. Like,
once again, it doesn't matter what we think or insist that this English word might be commonly used in modern parlance. Remember, we're looking at the word not in a vacuum in the document. We're not looking at it in a vacuum. We're looking at it contextually. The text around it gives shape to what the term cannot mean. And because it is juxtaposed with union, it cannot be synonymous with union. All right, there's a distinction that is drawn there. And I personally think that the document does a really good job at defining what marriage is, what formal blessings are, the role of informal, spontaneous blessings, what they say, what they don't, what it's for. For instance, it's not a validation of any sin that a person might have, because most people who receive blessings are sinners and they're struggling to live a holier life. I think the document does a good job of stating that sin can't be blessed, that only sexual relations within a marriage between a man and woman that's open to life, right? I mean, heck, you know, when I read that, I thought that people will have a bigger problem with the fact of being open to life, because I know a lot of people, non-Catholic Christians, for example, who have absolutely no intent of having children, just absolutely no intent of having children. And that wouldn't be a marriage. That absolutely wouldn't be a sacramental marriage. That lack of intent of openness to life would be an impediment. And if one of them wanted to leave, for instance, if they were both baptized, that would be clear grounds for annulment, a statement of nullity, that there was never a valid marriage there to begin with, because that lack of intent is an impediment to entering into a sacramental marriage, because a sacramental marriage, by definition, involves the procreation and education of children. So with that said, when I read that definition, I'm like, yeah, look at that. The document even went there, you know. So I think when we keep all of that in mind, I think that the word couple that people are having a problem with, they're only having a problem with it because of modern jargon and connotations that we use in this day and age. And I think that it's very clearly delineated in the text itself that these are two distinct things, because unions can't be blessed, right? That can't happen. But what we are looking at are the individuals who are in various kinds of relationships, and those individuals wanting to better those relationships and have better boundaries. It makes sense that the church is open to blessing all sinners who want to avoid all sins. So I think this is actually a very good thing.
What about a dance couple? What about a couple of people who are paired up on a ski chairlift? Or
It's interesting that people are even using these analogies. Like, what would be the purpose necessarily of using the word couple in all these other contexts to try to say, well, therefore you can understand the word couple in this context because of those contexts, because the word can mean that. Well, once again, I think within the text itself, we can come to understand by the context what couple cannot mean. And that's perhaps something that what people aren't focusing on, is what couple cannot mean in this context, because it's not a union, right? Those two things are being juxtaposed. So it's not necessary to appeal to the word couple in other contexts to show that couple can mean other things, other than the fact that these obviously would be suitable possibilities of how couple is being used here, right? But beyond that, it's the context itself of the document that helps us to understand what couple cannot mean. And I think the text is very clear on what it can't mean.
Mere quantity of people in a geographical location. Like, I could say, I hosted a party last night, and you would say, whoa, how many people came? And I'd be like, there was a couple. What's the relationship of that couple? Well, they are the amount of people who came to my party. But notice that I've qualified every kind of couple I just described. At no point did I merely just say a couple. There's a point of reference.
And the text itself has a point of reference. We know that it can't mean union.
For each one, I said a dance couple, a chairlift couple. How many people came to the party? A couple. And that's the only reason you know that they are distinct from the more common usage of that phrase. Because what if I was telling that story about my party in a different way to someone, and I said, a same-sex couple came to my party last night? Because that's what the declaration describes. You would immediately know what is meant by a same-sex couple.
What is interesting, and another thought I had along these lines, is somebody said, well, why doesn't this document say that sodomy is a sin? Like they wanted that to be a line in the document, which would be completely unnecessary because the document itself does a very beautiful job of talking about what is not morally permissible. In fact, when it refers to it is only in this context, which is talking about the Catholic doctrine of marriage, it is only in this context that sexual relations find their natural, proper, and fully human meaning. This is a way of stating in the positive. Okay? Now, if somebody wants to say, well, they should have put in here, well, and since that is true, therefore sodomy is wrong, which is once again, it's if other people wanted to write this document, I'm sure they'd probably end up putting stuff in there like that. I think it's completely sufficient to just say that marriage is the only context in which this is natural, proper, and fully human, to reiterate that outside of this, it would be unnatural or improper, or more mere animalistic, beneath human dignity, as people are basically offending on each other. They are, so.
That's not a mere quantity of individuals, and no sane person would treat it that way. It's a description of a relationship and the people in that relationship.
And like I said, I described what I take from that. Like I said, I don't have to appeal to anything outside the document to try to use couple in a way that I would be perfectly fine with two people who maybe they are a couple. That's how they think of themselves. They're in a romantic relationship, if we're going to use couple in that way, and they decide to go to mass for Christmas, for whatever reason, and they're cut to the heart for some reason, right? They're cut to the heart, and the Holy Spirit convicts them. They feel that something is off, or maybe they've kind of felt that before, and together they decide, you know what? Let's go get a blessing. Now, who's thinking that? Now, I know one of the difficulties is that when I'm describing this, how many people who are actively engaged in a same-sex couple will actually have the proper intent to better their relationship? Valid concern. Very valid concern. Given the fact that the document clearly states that there must be this intent to live a holy life and to follow the will of God and his designs, it would be very improper for people to simply assume what they erroneously believe the document to be saying and then pursue a blessing with the wrong motives. I'm sure this will happen. People will have wrong motives, but it won't be because of the document, because the document clearly states what their motives ought to be. So we, as a church, can talk about under what conditions could this occur. And that qualification in the text itself is going to hedge out, it could hedge out 95% of people who are in these kinds of situations where they're in an irregular relationship, or they're same-sex attracted people, or they're opposite sex attracted, and they've crossed some relational boundaries, right? What's the percentage of people? Well, that is really not the point of the document to say, 99 couples out of 100 are going to have the wrong intent. I think that's why, prudence on the part of the priest certainly will play an integral role here. But for the church to simply state under what conditions it could occur, an informal, spontaneous blessing that has that motive behind it, sure. Why not? Bless the crap out of that. You know what I mean? I see no impediments in line of what the church can do and what the church understands to be the conditions. Like I said, when it comes to the disposition of the people who are approaching anything in the church, whether it be baptism or the Eucharist or confession There will be grace there, and we know that there won't. It could be to their detriment. All right, to try to appropriate the sacraments for a purpose for other than they were instituted. That's problematic on the part of the individual, not being properly disposed. Right. This is the distinction, right, between in the context of sacraments. For instance, there's the man, I can't even remember the operato operanti. Gosh. I can't even find it. Ex opera operato. Ex opera operato. I'm sorry. I have a bad memory, but my mind's in the right place. So there's that sacramental context of ex opera operato, that the grace of God is going to be there, right? And this is not going to be, if the priest has a wrong intent there, or if the priest is unholy and stuff like that. If what the church does liturgically, then it's going to be true, right? That the God's grace is going to be there. We could say that in terms of the sacraments. The other is ex opera operanti or operantis, I think. That relates to the disposition of the individual, that the grace isn't just magical. You don't just partake of the sacrament and therefore, you have grace. There's a proper disposition of the individual. So this ex opera operanti, as it relates to having this proper disposition of the human heart and approaching anything in the church, whether it's a sacrament, whether it's a formal blessing or an informal spontaneous blessing, proper disposition is always the thing that is called for. So the church in this document makes it very clear what the motive is to be. Will people violate that? People violate formal blessings. People violate the Eucharist. People are properly disposed, haven't properly done an evaluation of conscience before going into the confessional. This is always the case across the board. It may even be argued that people who struggle with habitual sin and confess the same sin over and over again, we could be very judgmental and say, well, maybe you haven't received any sacramental grace from the sacrament, because you have to have a firm resolve to amend your life. And how could you have a firm resolve when you seem so flippant with your habitual sins? A priest could, given time, getting to know somebody, engaging in some spiritual direction and coming up with appropriate penances, we can get down to that level where a priest could end up turning certain people away. But if they're doing that, then there's could be instances where they misjudge the circumstance and they turn somebody away who, if somebody's like addicted to painkillers or something like that, and they are contrite, they certainly want to change their life. They're struggling with it, I would hate for a priest to misjudge me and say, I've heard this sin before. I don't really think you have a firm resolve. And so when the priests begin to get into I just have this general feeling that your heart isn't properly disposed right now, wouldn't be sufficient, And once again, how is the priest going to, on the cuff, right, in a spontaneous situation, possibly with people he doesn't even know, Maybe it could be argued that maybe a prudent thing would be for the priest to get to know the people first. You get to know their motives or intents and their lives, and what why they're seeking God and whatnot. That could be true. Just because the event is spontaneous, right? It doesn't mean that the blessing itself has to be immediate. There could be reflection. There could be dialogue. That they could be taken out of the view of the public. There's all kinds of things that aren't stipulated in the document itself that might be for the local bishop concerning his own diocese, what particular prudential judgments or the disciplines to put into place in regard to this document. But there wouldn't be anything in the document itself that would somehow allow for other motives that contradict the document. That's certainly not the case.
Attempt to direct attention towards said couple is attention given to the people and their relationship, and certainly a blessing is attention given towards them in some way. Therefore, the blessing is for the couple. And if you don't think so, imagine going out
and once again, whatever the relational dynamics of the two people coming up, and I'm willing to say it doesn't matter what those relational dynamics are. If there's a true desire for that relation dynamic to change and to become holier and have proper boundaries in the relationship, bless that all day long. Bless that all day long. People need God's grace, especially when a lot of bonding has taken place, especially if two people have been actively engaged in sexual acts that certainly, have a bonding chemical in the brain and so on and so forth. That can be very strong. It can be very difficult to change, to alter, to establish new boundaries in a way that could retain a friendship, for instance. It might be that they might have to just avoid the near occasion of sin and all associations which leads to them, and they might have to not be friends with that person anymore because it's just too difficult for them to resist being drawn in by that. And so that's another concern that people might have is, okay, these people right now, even implicitly, if they have the motive to desire God, God's plan for them might very well just be so that the friendship will have to just go their separate ways, not because of argument, but because they know that for their spiritual growth, that more appropriate relationships in their life would be proper. And that would be the work of God's grace in those circumstances. God's grace would work how it needs to work. God will do what God does. The Holy Spirit will lead them in what is going to be right for them. But if they can enter into that agreement with one another, that they want God's blessings in their life and they want to pursue the things of God, that is a distinct possibility that somebody could have that sense that I don't think that we're going to be able to have a mere platonic relationship or be able to talk on the phone for several hours at night. It's too much for me. The desire for the romantic feelings are just too intoxicating, and it just constantly distracts and draws me, and I don't want to live like that. It's like people browsing and shopping. You see all the stuff that you like, but you're not going to buy. Like going to a buffet and smelling all the food and wanting it. And it's like, but you can't eat it. It's let's not do that. And that may be, the majority of cases. Even a document doesn't stipulate all that stuff, but those are the kinds of implications you can draw, given the fact that the right motive and disposition needs to be there to receive the blessing.
for lunch with a friend, and when the server greets you, they ask you, "Oh, how nice. Are you a same-sex couple?" Would you in your head go, "Well, we're the same sex, and there's two individuals here, so yes, as a matter of fact, we are a same-sex couple"? Of course not. Of course not. Be honest, please. For the love of God, be
And like I said, it wouldn't matter how that term is being used.
honest. At the very least, if you're all about nuance and qualification, you'd ask for her to define her terms. But more likely than that, you would just say, no, we're just friends. Thanks for the intrusive question. Because everyone knows what that means, especially when you don't define it any other way. I could go survey pedestrians on the street and say, "Hey, what does a same-sex couple mean?" And they would answer how you would expect. They would say, two people of the same sex in an exclusive romantic, i.e. sexual, relationship. I could ask ChatGPT what it is based on its crawling and gathering of whatever consensus it can find in our society. And you know what? I just did. It says a same-sex couple refers to a romantic couple or a marital relationship between two individuals of the same gender. Let me emphasize the words romantic, marital, and relationship. The word marital is in there because a romantic relationship is oriented towards or is an imitation of the monogamous commitments of a marriage, which is why from a Catholic anthropology, a same-sex couple is a nonsensical concept.
Of course. If two people who describe themselves as such approach for a blessing, given everything that I have said, all the qualifications I have given that come from the text itself, and that the couple doesn't overlap what union is at all or any of that stuff, it really doesn't matter what the people think of themselves, though it may be commonly thought that by people that the couple means this or that. And I'm not even saying what the word couple means in the text, as long as it doesn't mean union and that a union itself is being blessed, right? Rather, it's just two individuals in a relationship. There's a relation between them in one way or another, right? And that relation could be described as anything. But it's never the church that's saying, "Oh, you two are together? Great. I'm going to bless the togetherness that you have." And I'm using together, not that they're just standing in close proximity to each other, but together in the sense that they are seeing one another. See all these euphemisms and language that we use that could get people to trip up intellectually as we intellectualize concepts and so on and so forth. But I don't have any problems with the document. I don't see any problems. Like, given all the qualifications I'm given, what couple can mean, and even outside of what it can mean, if it does mean this or that, it's irrelevant because there's so many qualifiers in the text that change how we have to interpret it, right? So people in any walk of life can come. Heck, you could even have two same-sex people who are married, and that's how they think of themselves. They could come up for a blessing. If the intent is, as the document says, to live according to God's design, to live a holier life, that all sexual relations outside of marriage between a man and woman open to life, again, I have open to life in there, only those things are natural, proper, and fully human. With all of that understood, with all the context that is there, bless these people. All right? They need God's grace to figure out their circumstance. They've got themselves in this circumstance. This is true of married and divorced Catholics who, quote unquote, get married to one another. Had several kids. It's been 20 years. And now, what do? they're going to need God's grace to figure all of that stuff out. That is just tough, absolutely tough. It reminds me of the relational difficulties in the movie Castaway, where the husband was presumed dead, right? So if it was a sacramental marriage and he's presumed lost at sea, dead, it's been what, 5 years? I don't remember the scale, but he had been gone for so long. Would it be permissible for her to enter into a sacramental marriage with another person without knowing absolutely for sure, or even knowing that you could never know, right? Because he could have been on the island forever. He could have decayed. It would just be bones. She's long gone, you know. In that kind of circumstance, where in this case she decided to marry, he was presumed dead. Not only did she really need God's grace to discern and try to figure out what to do with the fact that she's now alone, and he's very likely probably dead, and may never know either way, to discern what to do. Now, in this particular case, she did decide to marry and had a kid. And then, guess what? Husband shows up. He's still alive. Guess what? That's the sacramental marriage. What does she do with this guy and this kid? That really sucks for him. He thought he was entering into a sacramental marriage with somebody. It's so convoluted. It's so difficult, right? And so people get themselves in these kinds of situations by decisions that they make. And they may be good or they may be bad, but whatever the case is, when people in these circumstances, especially when they're bad, and now they're trying to change, that they're trying to figure out, well, what do we do now given this new information? You know, I have this conviction now that what we're doing is kind of unnatural. You know, there isn't that genital complementarity and functional compatibility here, and that's starting to mean something to me, you know. And the other person's like, you know, I've been thinking that same thing, you know. And it just so happens, you know, that they like, well, let's seek a blessing, you know. Like I said, is that going to be 1 out of a million? Maybe, but guess what? The document addresses that, you know, under what conditions. And if those conditions are extremely rare, they're extremely rare. So I think the problem lies in people wanting to use the document to state otherwise, you know, or, yeah.
It exists. It's a fictional construct attempting to portray something that doesn't exist. So when Fiducia Supplicans says that permission is granted for the blessing of same-sex couples, this is at best extremely confusing if you're trying to hold the orthodox line, or it's just incoherent and self-contradictory. And anyone saying it's not, at this point, I have to say, you are sinning against charity.
I will say, for anybody who is listening to this video, listening to my ramblings, right? And there's a lot. Most people, for instance, won't even watch this whole video. Kudos if you made it this far. I'm a talker. I'm a thinker. I put effort into this. That is a great benefit to me. Most people might not put a lot of thought into things, which is why they're more prone to misunderstanding the document and more willing to, you know, maybe even unknowingly misappropriate for one purpose or another that would be very beneficial to them in one way or another. It's very self-serving. But has anything that I have said in my explanations and the examples I've given and talking about the text, do you think that I am being uncharitable? Or do I have a valuable contribution to the conversation? clarifications, subtleties, nuances, distinctions that could be helpful, right? Because usually there's so many different components, so many aspects of these things, and being able to break down each of the constituent parts and formulate a synthesis requires quite a bit of reasoning and skill at interpretation, which, as I've said before, may not even because there's any ill intent or error in the text, but just like Scripture, that could be molded and shaped and interpreted in as many ways as there are interpreters, right? Saint Vincent of Lorraine spoke of this matter. But let's. I'm not even sure if we're not going to listen to this whole video because he does have a second theme in this. Right now, he's just focusing on the document. That's mainly what I wanted to talk about. But when he gets to talking about whether or not we should stay Catholic for this, that's another question, addressing where people might be at and having certain difficulties, right? And where he goes and explains examples of how those difficulties have clarifications in the text, and we can come to understand those properly so that the difficulty becomes resolved. I would like to think that this video that I have made, if it gets circulated, that people have the patience and intellectual capacity to hear what I'm saying, that hopefully it would resolve a lot of the conflict and controversial difficulties that people are presently having. And that is why this is not like a rebuttal video or an attack on Brian. It's me wanting to enter into the conversation. Brian just helped draw me into that, which I'm thankful for, because it turns out I had quite a bit to say on the subject. And I recognize that there's still need for clarification to help resolve those difficulties.
Given the very legitimate distress and confusion this has caused, if you refuse to acknowledge the confusion that people are suffering from and will suffer from, you are neglecting the love you owe your neighbors in the body of Christ.
I do recognize that quite often when texts come out, like when the Vatican II documents came out, people did all kinds of stuff to that. There was a lot of confusion because it's not so much the text necessarily, is that people are first influenced by a lot of interpretations of the text, characterizations of the text, summarizations that aren't quite as detailed as they need to be for a proper understanding of all of its aspects and how it all comes together and what its application is. That is something that requires time, but a lot of people don't have patience with things. Some people won't even read the article. They will just read a headline, and then they'll go and read the document with this preconceived notion that has been influenced by the media or by people who misunderstood the document, and this causes great confusion. And the thing is that confusion has risen to the level where even content creators seem to be on either side of a debate as to what the document means, how it's to be interpreted, what it can't mean, how it can't be utilized, and so on and so forth. There's a great deal of confusion out there. It does sadden me. I've been seeing this stuff for weeks. I don't remember when document was released. I'm not sure if it has a date on this thing. Yeah, December 18th. So, I mean, we're looking at day 12, right? Is that correct? We're looking at day 12 of people having conversations. 12 days, you know. While a individual with the proper interpretive training and intellectual skill may be able to work with the document, understand the document, and allow the document itself to frame and shape and mold how we come to understand other things in the document. Not only is something that most people don't have time for, 12 days is, in a sense, not a lot for the proper understanding of the document to kind of work itself through. And even after years, there'll probably still be people who continue to misunderstand the document. But hopefully this video is a boon in that regard to help people be a little bit more open and recognize what the document says, what it doesn't say, how I have described it, right? How these things can be reconciled and understood in the context and how it can be applied.
Christ. Okay, so things are bad in the church right now.
All right, so now he goes to talk about conflict. So you can hear the transitional language here. So I'm not cutting him off in the middle of a point that he's trying to make. I allowed him to speak freely for 10 minutes. Obviously, I interjected because I didn't want any copyright strikes. I have to kind of break in there every now and then. And also, to be fair to Brian, this is his content, you know. Yeah, he transitions here. He talks more about how should Catholics respond to this? Should this difficulty that people have with this, will this be something that should be an excuse to leave the church, and so on and so forth, which it's not. Don't allow Satan to put a wedge between you and the church. That's not going to work. You know, I'm reminded of Luther, you know, and the Pope didn't do and say and all the things that he would have liked and wanted things to be changed here, there, and both liturgically and doctrinally and so on and so forth. And, you know, he didn't get his way and he became a bull in a china shop. And it brought great spiritual confusion and difficulty. What I ask is that however this is being perceived, even if it's being perceived as having a wrong motive at the moment, give yourself some time, and more than 12 days, prayerfully considering the document. Consider some of my explanations, but most of all, don't go on social media and becoming a bull in the china shop. All right? It takes a long time to pick up those pieces. It does a whole lot of damage, and it completely makes the church look really ugly and unattractive. And I think we would be doing a great disservice to other people to not spend the proper amount of time to consider these things, and instead be rash and act inappropriately. I know some people, they get behind a keyboard and you know, they're not looking at a human being in the eyes, and they say things that they normally wouldn't say. And I just want to recommend that's the kind of charity that we need to have with people. We need to have patience. You know, when we're dialoguing with people, we don't know their intellectual capacity. We don't know their educational prowess. We don't know what they have read, what concepts they have discussed. And really, some people are still working through a lot of this stuff. And sometimes those dialogues can have ignorance on both sides, and they're not very beneficial, and they can become very heated quickly. So with that said, thank you for watching. I know I went over 10 minutes of Brian's material, and it took me 2 hours. Do you see how long it takes, right? You see how difficult it is to unravel this mess of strings once it gets out and it starts to become a problem for people. But I recommend just stay in prayer. Just, live out the serenity prayer, to accept the things you cannot change, the courage to change the things that you can, and the wisdom to know the difference, and be at peace with yourself, and find peace with God, and be content. So thanks for watching, everybody. God bless. If you like this material and you made it this far, you can like and follow. Comments are always welcome. Keep them charitable. I'm not interested in personal ad hominem attacks. I'm not interested in any debate. But what I am interested in is positive feedback that contributes to the understanding, the interpretation of this document as I have set forth here. So God bless, and may God keep you focused on the right things.